Okay, so episode 3, I'm kind of half and half on it, because half of it feels like retreading and pointless stuff and padding, while the other half deals with a subject that I find interesting, which is critical thinking versus emotional thinking. So as we talk about this episode, I'm mostly going to focus on those parts, because honestly, those parts I think are what's most important, and at the same time, it does reflect a lot of what happens today in the world, you know, from politics to social bias to everything else. And I think it ties back into their main theme of symbolism and perspective, which seems to be one of the themes of the entire Marvel Netflix series. So the first scene opens with Luke Cage standing over the body of the gangster that he just bounced all over the room. And when you see the guy's face, you're like, did someone just take a crowbar to a hip hop? I mean, damn, look at his face, it's all misshapen and swollen and everything. I thought, if he's not dead, he is definitely brain damaged. He's going to need some kind of reconstructive surgery. Luke Cage is going to jail. So given this damage is done to this other guy, Claire turns up, and before Claire can ask what's happened, he straight away offers an explanation, and it's the most minimalized, least context explanation that he could possibly give. He says, this guy was beating on his wife and kid, so I stopped him. I'm Luke Cage. I mean, talk about not giving a whole story. He knows what he did is wrong. I mean, you can see it on his face. He knows that he went too far, but he can't bring himself to describe to her the result of what she can clearly see in front of her eyes. And the reason why that is because he's scared. He's scared about how she will react. As if saying it in a minimized way will somehow make what she can see in front of her somehow seem less. The long and short of it is he's trying to remove context from the actual situation. And you know what? He's right to be scared of Claire, because Claire makes a really good point about all he had to do was actually just tap him on the head. It's something he does all the time. Why didn't he just do that then? And she's right. That's what happens when you think about it in context. That's all he actually had to do. He's got the power to do that. And he knows that. Then you got that scene where Bushmaster wakes up with the two ladies. You're like, okay, cool. What's going to happen here? And not much happens, really. All he ends up doing is saying how Luke Cage is the heart of the city and I gotta get rid of him, blah, blah, pretty much retreading everything he said in the last episode. So I'm just like, I don't care. I don't care about that scene. And then the scene where Mariah is having dinner with her daughter, that's not quite retreading, but it feels a lot like retreading. What it's really doing is adding more of a picture so you understand the daughter's perspective a little bit more. She talks about hushed conversations in rooms and seeing bloody towels everywhere and things like that. Honestly, it does paint a bit more of a picture of how mysterious things were for her, like everything was going on without her directly seeing what was going on. But I kind of got that impression anyway from before, so I didn't really find all that very interesting. And even though it described more of a picture for me to visualize, it was kind of the picture I was already visualizing and it didn't add anything to it. Though there was a couple of other interesting things about the scene, like this show is obsessed with crowns and symbolism and power. So for example, it's when they have Cottonmouth or Mariah standing in front of the Biggie Smalls portrait and always have these camera shots where you can see them and you can see the crown just over their head, symbolizing maybe their leadership or whatever was going on in the scene and at that time of the story. Well, it seems they've done it again in this scene. When they show the camera shots of Mariah and the daughter whilst they're having dinner, the camera shows a lot of space above their head. And above each of them, there's kind of this crown type thing. So above the daughter, it's got these lights or chandelier, and it kind of looks like a halo over her. And over Mariah, it's got some kind of artistic structure that looks like a very crooked crown. Now, I'm not sure entirely what that's saying really, but it just leads me to think that she's a crooked leader and is going to be using politics to try and get herself back in a public light. So that's a lot of manipulation and lies and narrative over truth. And the daughter is this angelic good guy. Don't worry everybody, she's definitely a good guy, even though she gives super drugs to supervillains. But anyway, right as the daughter's talking about how shifty things were in the house growing up, then suddenly, Shades, what the f***? Were you standing there the entire time, you creepy son of a bitch? And he's all like, we need to have a hush conversation in the corridor. And the mum's like, yeah, sorry, I've got to go. We've got to have a hush conversation in the corridor. Right after the daughter's been complaining about the hush conversations she grew up around that were in the corridors. I mean, I get what they're going for, but it's a bit on the nose. So they have their hush conversation in the corridor, and Shades is pissed off because Mariah is prioritizing the daughter. And the reason she's prioritizing the daughter is because the daughter is a gateway to getting back some of her public life, which is all part of her overall plan to move away from a life of crime by committing a really big crime. But in Shades' view, maybe his glasses are kind of giving him a bit of tunnel vision. He's like, that daughter is getting more attention than me. I don't like it. And then as he's walking out, he sort of shoots a look at her. You're like, damn. Yeah, he's going to kill her. He's going to kill her at some point. He's just going to lose his shit and kill her. And what's funny is it then shows her. She's like, damn, he's going to kill me at some point in this series. I know I'm going to die. So overall, did I even like the scene? I kind of felt like a good chunk of it was retreading, even though it wasn't really retreading. but at the same time, I did get something out of it. But if I'm really honest, if that scene wasn't there, I would not have cared. Now, I missed these scenes. I noticed that in every shot where she's talking to the police, she's never on screen at the same time as the other police, unless she's walking away from them, at least in this episode. So I think they're trying to show the separation between her and the rest of her colleagues at work. Now, maybe that's because she's going to take the road to becoming a superhero? Or maybe it's just to show that there is a separation between them at the moment. I am a fan of Misty. I do like her whole go-get-em attitude. But I am not on her side. I'm sorry. I know you know that Luke Cage is out there doing what cops can't do and you really want to help too. But you're a cop and you've gone back to work and your boss has basically said, just follow these rules. You need to be on a trial period. Once you do that, you can get back to it. And the one thing she does is the opposite of everything her boss tells her to do. So I'm sitting there thinking, how is she not fired or suspended or told to go home or whatever? And she's there getting all upset of, oh my gosh, my boss is telling me to follow procedure. Oh my gosh, how can this be? But then her boss calls her into the office and tells her that he would fire her, but he can't because the people above him see her as some kind of mascot for the police department. Now, I thought those scenes were okay, but I also thought they were a bit frustrating because you're watching Misty just constantly not do what she's told to do by her boss. Which means if she did catch anyone, they would probably have a field day of it in court because she hasn't followed proper procedure in trying to catch anyone. But I am glad that the boss did address the fact of what's going on and why he hasn't gotten rid of her. Now, when her boss had a go at her, now I would have preferred it if she had realised that, oh my gosh, I've got a lot of power right now. But instead she was hurt. She didn't like the idea of being seen as a mascot. And I do get that. And the only reason why I like that she stormed off is because of the next scene that she's in. And that next scene was Misty going to train with Carling Wing. And when I saw her, I was like, yes, Carling Wing. Because other than just being freaking awesome in the Netflix universe at the moment, she was also the best thing about the Iron Fist Netflix series. Now, unlike most people, I actually kind of like that series. I like the whole Meacham stuff and so on and so on. I mean, I thought it dragged on a bit much, but I did overall like it. The two things I didn't like were the mediocre fight scenes, which a lot of people didn't like, and I didn't really like Iron Fist himself. I mean, for a lot of the same reasons people didn't like him. He whined too much, he's called Iron Fist and barely ever Iron Fists anything. That came out badly. But the main thing that bugged me about him, which is also why I loved Carling Wing, is because the one thing that show does really well, which is totally in my range of interest, is deal with ideology and how fanaticism functions within ideologies. And both Iron Fist and Carling Wing go on the same journey. Both of them start at different sides of a fanatic ideology. And as the story goes on, they both get confronted by reality, and they have to critically think and gradually adjust their understanding, frankly, of the universe, not just of the sides, but of what good and evil is and everything in between, for them to finally get to a better place at the end of the story. Now, that really only happened for one person, and it wasn't Iron Fist, which is a big problem because he's supposed to be the hero. Iron Fist did the thing that a lot of people do. Oh my god, the real world is too scary, I'm going to become a snowflake and basically cry all the time because I'm a victim of everything. And where he was a victim of some stuff, he conflated everything to be constantly against him, and he just became whiny and annoying. Carling Wing, on the other hand, went through the same thing, but as she came across these obstacles, she was like, well, maybe I might be wrong. Maybe I have to start looking at things from another point of view. And she's constantly looking for dialogues with other points of view throughout the series so she can get a better context for herself. So obviously that's why I really liked her in Iron Fist, and that's kind of what made it for me. And then in this thing, she starts applying some of that critical thinking here for Misty. While she's training with Misty, Misty's been really down on herself and just not listening to anything that Carling's saying. So Carling knocks her down. She's like, yeah, bam. And then Misty's like, oh, you feel good about beating down a cripple. And Carling's like, ah, so you see yourself as a cripple. Now we know where we're starting. That is how you see yourself. You got to see yourself as not just that. And effectively, she's being the critical thinking for Misty, while Misty's going through her emotional stuff at the moment, which is the same as Claire being the critical thinking for Luke Cage, while Luke Cage is going through his emotional stuff at the moment. So I did think she took it a little far when they went for a drink, and then Misty gets in a fight. She's like, yeah, man, you go handle yourself against all those guys at once. I mean, turns out Misty's a badass. And in the end, Carling joins in and they just beat the crap out of everyone. And that was kind of cool. It's a cool comic book moment. But at the same time, I'm like, sis, go back her up, man. What are you doing? I know there's a bit of therapy involved, but damn. And then you get an awesome Luke Cage action scene. Now, I don't mean awesome in the sense of this was some epic battle or some major butt kicking or anything like that. It was awesome because we actually learned a lot from the scene. And this scene acts a lot like the Thor's hammer scene from Avengers Age of Ultron that I talked about in my Thanos video. Now that might sound a bit weird, but this is how. Luke Cage busts in, looking like a badass, music's going off, I'm getting flashbacks of Shaft and Black Dynamite, and I want to see him just mess shit up, so I'm loving it. But what is also happening at the time is he goes in, has a bit of banter, everybody surrounds him, It's all a big comic book kind of scene, which is exactly what I want. I want to see him be a badass. And then the thing that happens is the bad guys basically test him. They go up to him one by one and they each do a different thing. So they go from chains to swords to guns, but then one of them throws a grenade at him. And you're like, okay, I wonder how this is going to work. And he catches it. It's not like a firework blowing up on a pavement. It's a firework blowing up in your hand. Only it's a freaking grenade. And what's also about it is it explodes. And it doesn't even budge his head. So it shows how strong he is to contain that explosion and how little damage it actually did to him at the same time. But the reason why it's like the Thor's hammer kind of scenario is, one, because it creates a gauge for us to know how powerful it is. Two, us, the viewer and the villain are learning the information at the same time. So you're discovering it with participants within the show. And three, it sets up later for showing just how powerful the bad guy might just be. So the Claire Temple and Luke Cage scenes, honestly, I really did like them. The whole thing is basically an example of critical thinking versus irrational bias. And back when I did sociology, my main focus was on how irrational bias intersects and functions within society. And because of that, I was always going to be interested in these particular scenes more than some of the others, because I'd want to see how they portray that function within the context of the show, and if they do it well or accurate or not. Now, before I go into these scenes a little bit more, just because they're interesting to me, most of it can actually be summed up by an interaction Luke Cage and Claire Temple had when they were in the barbershop. Claire walks in and Luke Cage starts by saying, "Are you going to talk to me or talk at me?" Now, either way, that's really important because it immediately creates a narrative that he's the victim in whatever the dialogue is that they're about to have. And if she says something that he doesn't agree with or finds offensive, he's the victim and she's attacking him. If she agrees with him, then it's talking with him. You notice how none of it's to do with what she might be having to say and him having to listen. So Claire tells him that it's unfair to say that, and obviously it is because it's kind of lacking in context there. So the next thing he does is he then escalates the narrative to make him more of a victim, and he complains about how she called the police on him, which obviously is him saying, look, I'm the one being persecuted here, you're the one who called the police on me, you've made me the victim here. And that's how he sees it in his narrative. So when Claire responds, she says, actually, I called the ambulance for the person that you hurt, and I called Misty for you. Misty called the police. And that is pretty damn significant, because what Luke Cage did was all of those steps that she just described, which is the context of the consequence of the actions he took. He ignored all of that and jumped straight to, you called the police on me, so he could be the victim. If you add all that context in, suddenly she's not such the bad guy. She didn't call the police on him. He added to an already bad situation, which had consequences, and he doesn't want to face up to that. He doesn't want to take blame or responsibility for that part. So you see what Luke Cage did? He literally ignored the reality of what had happened so he could maintain himself as being the victim in this argument. And why does he do that? It's because he's scared. He's scared about her reaction. He's scared about what that might make him. He's scared about what issues it might mean he might have. And whatever issues he's got, it came out as beating someone nearly to death and trying to justify it when he had the power not to take that route at all. And that's what happens when you start at absurd and you want to keep that view. You can only ever get more absurd. And people wanting to do that will remove context to any extreme. There is no upper limit to how crazy it will be. Even to the point of them literally denying reality in front of them and having a different version of history.
Victor, you're wrong. Jay Johnson, the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama, said on Thursday that they were separating families, and they actually were asking Mexico to enforce their southern border.
There were no families separated.
That's not correct. That's not correct.
The interview was here.
Victor, that's not correct. Go read the transcript.
The control room is watching this. We'll get the soundbite and we'll play it for the viewers.
Okay.
We will settle this one.
There's no policy or practice, at least on my watch, to separate women, parents from their children.
There might be individual cases of it?
There were, I'm sure, individual cases for reasons of health or safety, but we did not have that policy or practice, and it's not something I would have adopted. It's not something I would have permitted.
Fact. Amy
Victor?
Kremer.
Okay,
Thank you
well,
so much.
I don't have the ability to pull up what I read, but it happened.
Because everybody lives in their own universe. Everybody has their own perspective. And it's easier and mostly quicker to create an emotive narrative than it is to include context and try and be critical about it. Being critical actually takes time. Which is why Luke Cage quickly came up with that narrative to maintain his point of view, and then Claire had to take time to actually address the context that he missed out. And rather than address any of those points that she made, because he knows she's right, because that's the actual reality of it, he just maintains his point of view and is like, well, sometimes this shit's gotta be done. He knows it's not a good enough reason, obviously, but he doesn't want to be wrong because he's scared, because it would show what kind of person he might be becoming. and he's already at a point where he excludes the consequences of his actions and his perspective.
Quit trying to make us feel teary-eyed for the children. Yes, I love children a great deal, but to me, it's up to the parents to do things rightfully and legally.
And that's actually what happens. Doesn't matter what you believe in, the extreme versions of any belief or ideology, when it comes to how they reason, they all think the same, talk the same, and given the opportunity and resources will act the same. The only difference is the particular brand that they're with. It's actually really predictable because they all have to avoid critical thinking in the same way. And again, it's also why extreme views tend to be against science and critical thinking, because those things will start introducing information that might bring their view into some form of contradiction.
I mean, I hate to be the dissenter here, and I'm not saying this because of Donald Trump, but I honestly don't think that this fact-checking business, as we're all into this, is anything more than one more sort of out-of-touch elitist media type thing. I don't think people out here in America care.
I mean, it's not magic, it's science. It's literally why we have critical analysis. So we can indicate bias and irrational bias and social biases. I mean, the process is used as part of peer reviewing papers. So the rest of the Luke Cage and Claire scenes are effectively this function going over and over and over again, just with different words being used. I mean, some of the dialogue's a bit on the nose. I mean, it feels a little forced to try and get the view across. I think they could have just had better dialogue overall, to be honest. But the point of what they were trying to do was actually pretty good. So Luke Cage starts going on about how she can't castrate him. So the first thing she does is she calls him on that and says, so stopping you from going too far and getting taken to jail is the equivalent of making you less of a man. That's what you're trying to say. That is the things you're equating right now. And again, painting himself as the victim and removing context. Then Luke Cage tries to put forward an argument, basically saying being more brutal is working, it's getting shit done. And because he's using it to fight bad guys, that still makes him a hero. And Claire, straight off the bat, tells him that his definition of hero needs to be reevaluated. And on that, she's right. There's two different definitions that they have for the word hero. So they are literally coming from two completely different perspectives. So for example, for some people, the Punisher might be their idealized version of what a hero is. For other people, it might be someone like Spider-Man. Both of them effectively fight bad guys, but the context for both of those heroes are very different things. And also reflects two key ways on how they think heroes should deal with problems. And one of those is based on instilling fear and harm in who they see as the enemy, whereas the other one is based on proportional force. And proportional force requires taking on board context. I mean, at the end of the day, you can also break it down to long-term and short-term thinking. In the short term, he can crack some heads and people will be scared and he'll get stuff done, but he's going to build up resentment against him, and in the long term, that'll turn against him. So Claire explains to him that he's scaring people through his actions. And then Luke Cage goes off on this whole narrative about how he always scares people. It's just how the world is. Everybody looks at him and they're scared of him because he's a big black guy, and that's how social bias is in society. But one doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other. People being scared of you is not the same as you going out and trying to instill fear. The context being removed here is his own agency and the responsibility for his own behavior. So Claire responds to that with, yeah, she has to deal with racism too. It might not be exactly the same, but the whole point is to rise above the labels and stereotypes that are being put on you. But then Luke Cage doubles down with that and basically says that the way the world works, if you're a black man, you can either be scary or bow your head. So what Luke Cage has done is he's reduced a black man to the context of two absolutes that he's just presented. And he's using it on himself, to be quite honest. He now puts himself into one of those two caricatures, which is exactly the opposite of what Claire was saying. You have to rise above the labels. Those labels don't define who you are, and you don't have to become what those labels present to you. And because he's put himself in one of these two categories, he's actually removed context of himself as a person. He's actually dehumanized himself. He's becoming more and more absurd, so he can stick with the narrative that he is still the victim regardless of all the points that she is making. And she even calls him on that. And then next, Luke goes on to complain how her and Pops have been putting pressure on him to do the right thing, and so now he's doing it, and she calls him out again immediately, saying, look, you're shifting the responsibility to us. You control your own actions at the end of the day. And then Luke Cage argues that being brutal is being responsible. That's now his argument. Being brutal and instilling fear is now the responsible thing to do as a hero. That is what he is now arguing. Because from his point of view, he feels that level of force is necessary. And then Claire calls him out again and starts listing examples of the different people that he's shifting blame to avoid taking it on board himself. And as soon as she mentions his dad, he immediately doesn't want to even involve that context in the conversation. And this entire time, Claire's been countering every one of his excuses with context, and everything he's been doing is trying to remove context to keep his narrative. And that's why he's been getting more and more absurd with his narrative. And eventually, he's got nowhere to go. And rather than admit that he might be wrong, that all these other points that have been brought up might be relevant and he should have to take them on board and then reanalyze his view, he loses his shit and beats the crap out of a wall. And the reason why is because he started at absurd, didn't want to take on board context, and he can only ever get more absurd. And eventually, he becomes violent because there's nowhere else for him to go in the argument. And his entire reasoning is based on fear. Fear of not living up to being the right kind of hero. Fear of not being able to stop all the crime that he's trying to stop. Amongst all the other pressures that's been piled on him over the last season in this. And it's driving him nuts that no one else sees just how dangerous or just how bad or just how scary things are. Which is why, in his view, it's necessary for him to take the measures that he takes. And then that's where Claire has had enough, because she knows if he's going to lose his shit and turn violent over a conversation because he can't take on board more context, what's the next step? He could then do that to somebody else, and he's so powerful he could do it by accident. And he won't even take any responsibility for his perspective or his actions. And the consequences that will come from acting this way, in his eyes, will make him more of a victim because he felt it was necessary to do it. And it will just spiral into further absurdity. All because that fear won't allow him to take on more context so he can adjust the level of fear he should have. And then so she steps away. And honestly, good on her, man. You got to step away. You can't put yourself in harm's way like that. You can't force someone to change their point of view. You can only do your best to make them feel safer so then they can be more open to taking on board context. But right now, Luke Cage is in that mode where he believes everything is against him. Overall, I think they've done a good job with the scene and utilizing that social function over and over and over again for the context of the show. And they did show what happens when people start to avoid the critical line and just they have to get more and more and more absurd. And it's great that they show it in the context of this relationship and him trying to be a superhero and trying to choose which path is the right path. So Claire leaves Luke Cage and Luke Cage is bummed and he goes out for a walk trying to clear his head, trying to maybe get a better perspective on things because he knows something must be wrong if his girlfriend just left him. And while he's wondering that, while he's pondering about how somehow the universe is victimizing him right now, you get this uppercut come out the screen. What do sure you can? And then that's it. Damn. And what you see is Bushmaster, he just sucker punched the guy. And I'm like, oh, that's how they're gonna do it. That's when they're gonna throw it in, when you're least expecting it. While the storyline is crapping on Luke Cage, then the bad guy's gonna come in and just crap just a little bit more. I was like, damn. Well, okay, that's a pretty cool way to introduce that. Yeah, I want to see what happens next. End credits. What? Well, okay, fine. I'm going to watch the next episode. Overall, I thought this was a good episode. I did feel like there was a good chunk of retreading, but the stuff that I found interesting, I found really interesting, as you could probably tell from this video. But with that, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to go and check out the next episode of Luke Cage. I just want to say thank you guys for taking the time to check out this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like, and I'll catch you guys next time.